can definitely share this webinar with them later on this week, perhaps, as we're hoping to publish this on our Young AJP YouTube page. Or if you wanted to rewatch it 1 to 10 times, that's totally fine too, of course. And secondly, Ayanthi has created an incredible resource document for us as well, and attached a copy of her presentation slides. So I'll also be sending a link with that at the end of the presentation as well. I think that's the main stuff I had to get through. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ayanthi.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Satara. And thank you for everyone for joining me tonight. I had initially suggested just a mindfulness workshop for the Young AJP earlier this year, pre-COVID. But the more that I mulled over it and just sat on it for a while, it just completely transformed into something a lot more broad and general, which is why it's now become mental health for animal rights activists. It was really exciting and quite interesting putting this presentation together, it being two of my favourite passions intersecting really beautifully. Let me just share the screen now. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar, this is Patty Mark. She is the founder of Animal Liberation Victoria, and she's also the pioneer of open rescue. And that has entailed her being direct witness to a lot of the horrors of animal exploitation and abuse in all of these animal agricultural businesses. She's been inside slaughterhouses, she's been in darkened sheds, she's been in factory farms, feedlots and paddocks, she's been inside transport trucks and ships, and she's been doing this all over the world. And in fact, she's been doing this for 30 years. In this photo in particular, she's holding a rescued piglet named Shmuel. He was actually found emaciated on a RSPCA approved farm. He was so close to death, but he was rescued. And unfortunately, he did not survive, but at least at the very last few days of his life, he got to experience some love, compassion, and dignity by Patty and her team of other animal rights activists. I can only imagine the amount of distress that she's experienced from this first-hand witness of all of this animal abuse. And anyone who's interested in learning more about Patty and her experience, I really recommend listening to the Joey Carbstrong podcast from a couple of months ago where he interviewed her. I also want to remind everyone that this presentation will only go for about an hour and a bit. It's not a whole lot of time to cover all of the intricacies of mental health as it relates to animal rights activists. So I do implore anyone who does need further assistance to actually get in contact with a mental health professional, see a psychologist, and do some therapy. I know a lot of people sort of don't consider therapy unless they're in complete crisis mode. I mean, I'm sure a lot of us are, but even if you are not, it's a really helpful avenue. So it's something I really encourage. I've got a little bit more information about how to do that, how to see a psychologist on that resource document that Satara will link later on. And also to let you know that this presentation is not a substitute for therapy. This is just a quick sort of overview over acceptance and commitment therapy as it applies to mental health. So my goal is that by the end of this presentation that you'll feel that your difficulties and challenges are validated and normalized, that you have a bit of a theory and a framework to understand your experiences, and that you'll get to absorb some skills that you can then start implementing in your day-to-day life. So what is acceptance and commitment therapy? Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is just a therapeutic modality. It's used in the treatment of things like depression, anxiety, chronic pain is a big one, OCD, disordered eating, just to name a few. ACT is the dominant modality that I use as a psychologist in my own therapy, and it's the philosophy and strategies that I implement in my own personal life as well. So much of the content of this presentation are things that I deal with personally quite constantly, and it's been a really solid reflective exercise, and also a reminder of what managing our mental health actually looks like as animal rights activists. It's a lot of introspection, it's a lot of skills building, because there's no magic pill for this stuff. And the aim of this talk is not to have the goal of like eradicating or completely removing our distress, because it's futile. That's sort of an inherent part of what it is that we do. So that's not the aim here. It's more about how can we just manage it so we can still do what we need to do. So I thought this next quote perfectly summed up how we feel in our position as animal rights activists and why it is so important that we look after ourselves in this movement. So Andrew Boyd says, compassion hurts. When you feel connected to everything, you also feel responsible for everything, and you cannot turn away. Your destiny is bound with the destinies of others. You must learn to carry the universe or be crushed by it. You must grow strong enough to love the world, yet empty enough to sit down at the same table with its worst horrors. So to provide a bit more context to this presentation, we need to know why animal rights activists even exist in the first place. Why are there people advocating for the rights of animals? Do animals deserve rights? Tom Regan puts it succinctly. All animals are somebody, someone with a life of their own. Behind those eyes is a story, the story of their life as they experience it. In our culture, we have been encouraged to think of animals as things, as commodities. The great challenge lies in having a change of perception, the realization that they have a life of their own, independent of their utility to me or to anyone else. Even as activists, we can be so incredibly naive to the vast scale of oppression because of how difficult it is to visualize these numbers. So just to rattle off a few, per year, we have 190 million animals used in experimentation. We have 72 billion land animals killed for food. We have 2 trillion sea animals killed for food. Animal agriculture as a whole is built on the selective breeding of animals who have become so physically manipulated that they do not and could not exist in the wild. We have egg-laying hens who have been bred to lay up to 300 eggs per year, as opposed to the 12 or thereabouts that their wild cousin, the jungle fowl, lay. We have day-old male chicks in the industry who are macerated alive on their first day of life, as they are considered a waste product of the industry. Their sex means that they're not going to grow up to lay eggs and therefore they are not economical. This is humane waste management, according to the RSPCA. Sexual exploitation is inherent to all of these industries through artificial insemination and forced impregnation. Animals are not consenting and they are often constrained when they are inseminated. The females are forced to endure repeated pregnancies until they are no longer reproductively viable. Calves are torn away from their mothers so her milk can be stolen from her. We've got mother pigs who are kept in farrowing crates, that's a picture here, where she's unable to turn around or nurture her young. So essentially her motherhood is completely denied. Pigs are stunned by being forced onto gondolas to be lowered into gas chambers where they scream and thrash while their insides burn from the CO2 gas. We have animals who are slaughtered at a fraction of their lifespan. I mean, these animals are essentially children or in their adolescent stage compared to their entire lifespan. We have animals being broken in so that they can be used for transportation, for heavy loads, for tourists to ride on them, for hobby, sport, cultural and entertainment processes. So essentially, we are mass enslaving and massacring sentient beings to meet consumer demand. This is a lot of information to process, which leads us to why should animal rights care about their mental health? So according to Jacobson and Lindblom, social movement activism requires emotional motivation and entails emotional costs. And because of this, activists tend to be deeply involved in the management of emotions or emotion work, and not just in connection to protest events, but also on an everyday basis. So Anyone who cares about living a valued life should care about their mental health. And animal rights activists specifically are exposed to the reality of large-scale systematic violence against animals. And we're exposed to this through reading content, viewing of imagery, especially video format imagery, which, and editing as well, being exposed to constant distressing imagery, and also bearing direct witness to the plight of animals in these exploitation industries. We experience a profound sense of responsibility to eliminate animal oppression, and it makes us vulnerable to self-blame and hopelessness when change is slow. So well-managed mental health, which we want to prioritise, can mitigate burnout, trauma, compassion fatigue. It can help us to develop resilience that benefits us as individuals, and it also allows for sustainable activism. So I want to take a closer look at the science behind some of these phenomena. So a group of European researchers wanted to find out whether there were differences in the empathy of vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores. Just for the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the omnivores and the vegans. It was a pretty small study. They only had a sample size of 60. However, they did still find some pretty meaningful results. So what they did was, prior to the study, they had all of the participants complete an empathy quotient assessment. So it's sort of like an IQ test, but for emotions and empathy. And they measured their self-reported levels of empathy. So the results were that vegans received an average score of 44.6, while omnivores scored 38.8. This was shown to be a statistically significant difference, with vegans having more empathy. After completing this assessment, the participants were presented with a mixture of pictures involving human suffering, animal suffering, and they also had a neutral stimulus, which was just landscape photos. So during this procedure, the participants were hooked up to an MRI machine to read their neural activity as they were observing this imagery. So what they had found was that vegans showed a notably higher engagement of the empathy-related brain regions when showed images of suffering, and that was regardless of whether they were human or animal suffering, which is inconsistent with their higher EQ scores. And vegans showed an even stronger engagement of empathy when viewing images of animal suffering, which I guess is no surprise really. In these instances, more regions of the brain were activated. And interestingly, the activated brain regions are the ones that are thought to be associated with representations of the self, self-values, memories, and visuospatial processing. And the suggestion here is that vegans see the suffering of animals as related to their own sense of self. Then after seeing animal suffering, the right amygdalas of the vegans showed less activation than that of omnivores. So the amygdala is associated with feelings of fear and threat and is responsible for the whole fight or flight response, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. The researchers hypothesized that the decreased activation when faced with animal suffering was the brain's attempts to regulate emotions in response to this stressful stimuli. And again, this relates back to the previous statement about activists doing a lot of emotional work and emotional regulation. When viewing animal suffering, there was also a direct relationship with higher EQ scores and increased brain activity in empathy-related areas in vegans. In omnivores, this relationship was inverse. So I would be really curious for future research to assess whether the structural differences in these brains are innate or whether they can develop over time through brain plasticity. Is there actually a genetic predisposition to veganism, or can empathy towards animals be learnt? So if there are any neuroscientists in here, there's some future research there for you. So what is the impact of increased empathy for vegans and animal rights activists? Leads us to Vistopia, who our very own vegan psychologist, Claire Mann, coined this term a few years ago to capture the unique distress that we experience. So according to Claire, Vistopia is an existential crisis experienced by vegans arising out of an awareness of the trance-like collusion with a dystopian world, and the awareness of greed, ubiquitous animal exploitation, and speciesism in a modern dystopia. In simple terms, I see this as we experience distress over the knowledge of mass-scale animal exploitation and abuse, and also another layer of distress with the recognition that wider society, everyone, well, most people who surround us, our loved ones, contribute, encourage, embrace, and celebrate even the fact that these animals are being exploited, or they benefit from that and are apathetic towards making any change. So Claire goes on to say that the veil of deceit, lies, and ignorance has been removed from the vegans' eyes, and they see the world through a very different lens. They must also live with the ignorance of others who minimize, ridicule, resist, or ignore the reality the vegan tries to share. The vegan doesn't see people eating food. They see the horror of the slaughterhouse instead of steak, a mother cow grieving for her lost calf instead of the milk and cheese, and instead of pork, pigs incarcerated in pens the size of their own bodies. As the other person puts that animal into their mouth, the vegan feels that their family are being eaten, and their heart breaks a little bit more. I'm sure there are others who can relate to me on this, but I've certainly found that the deeper I've gone into activism, the more intensely I experience Vistopia. Like I used to cringe and feel perturbed by watching others eat animals back when I was a vegetarian teenager. And I even boycotted sitting on my parents' leather couch all the way back then. But now I can barely walk past a butcher shop without experiencing a visceral emotional reaction. And I have flashes of tormented animals pass through my mind. The cognitive dissonance that a lot of non-vegans experience has well and truly evaporated when you get to this point of being a vegan and even more so being an activist. Vystopia is not a mental illness. You won't find it in the DSM. Rather, it is a normal response any feeling human being should have after discovering the nature and extent of society's systematic animal abuse. And some level of experiencing Vystopia is inherent to being an animal rights activist. Can you imagine being compelled to use your time, your energy, your money, your resources to commit to fighting against an injustice if it did not cause you any distress to begin with? And the other thing is we don't necessarily want to get rid of Vystopia. Vystopia is really a sign that we care and we feel deeply. But what we want to be able to do is to be able to be gentle with ourselves and to be able to practice self-compassion because of the Vystopia. So Vystopia can be perpetuated by trauma. And again, we have this quote from Viktor Frankl, who says, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. I want to specify here that I am talking about vicarious trauma. The primary trauma is what the animals experience, and the vicarious or secondary trauma is what we experience by being witness to their suffering. I also want to note here that trauma is a phenomenon in and of itself. Trauma doesn't have to be PTSD. And I'm not saying that we all have PTSD due to what we experience, although some of us may, because PTSD involves meeting a really specific criteria in the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that we use as psychologists. And so PTSD should only be diagnosed by a professional. So just wanted to mention that. Also, according to the DSM, exposure to electronic or print media does not constitute as trauma. I don't necessarily agree with this, but just so you know. So what does vicarious trauma consist of? In terms of animal rights activism, traumatization can develop through the exposure of an isolated case of animal violence or through repeated exposure. And I think most of us would fall into the latter category there. So what it consists of is re-experiencing symptoms. So this includes things like flashbacks of having witnessed animals being caged, or if you've been to a vigil, those images coming back to you at other times, and related intrusive thoughts. We have avoidance, and this can be internal avoidance. So this is like trying to suppress or distract yourself from thoughts or feelings that are related to that trauma. So for example, this could be using substances to numb those flashbacks and memories. And then the external avoidance can be things like just making efforts to avoid certain places, people, certain conversations, such as keeping away from establishments that serve animal products, which is probably a good thing to do, to be honest. Then we've got change in mood and beliefs. Changes in mood include increased negative mood states and decreased positive mood states. Also, beliefs about ourselves, other people, and the world can be impacted. So if our beliefs were negative prior to the trauma, they may be strengthened. And if they were positive, then following the trauma, they can change into significant negative beliefs. So this could include things like misanthropy, and also a hardening core belief, some of which include things like I am incompetent, I am unworthy, I am defective, things of that nature. And then we've got hypervigilance. So this includes feeling a heightened sensitivity to the surroundings and the perceived threat. So this could be heightened anxiety when witnessing the animal flesh and secretions in the meat, milk, and egg aisles in grocery stores. So what can trauma lead to? We've got burnout. So burnout are a cluster of symptoms that include physical depletion, feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, disillusionment, the development of negative self-concept, and also negative attitudes towards work, people, and life itself. So an activist burnout specifically, it refers to what happens when people who are once deeply embedded in these movements, people who had every intention of staying engaged, are forced to disengage due to the stress of the impact of participation. The deterioration of activist well-being can result in the deterioration of the social movement's viability. So it is really integral that if we want to maintain our work towards animal liberation, that we must prioritise looking after ourselves for our own sake and also for the sake of the animals. Animal rights activists, we are so hyper-aware and profoundly impacted by these instances of violence and structural oppression that we see this abuse everywhere, as we discussed with Vistopia, and we carry the emotional weight of internalising this violence that other people ignore. As a result, we are susceptible to feelings of guilt for not doing more and also frustration about the slowness of change. And this leads to 5 different types of emotional labour that are typical in animal rights activists. We have containing. So this is the idea of being able to suppress negative emotions when necessary to control our naturally impulsive or even repulsive reactions. So let's say, for example, you're doing some street outreach and you're outreaching to a passerby at a cube who is defending animal abuse, and they bring up the whole plants feel pain argument. This is a really common one that we come across all the time. So instead of lashing out in frustration, you make room for this frustration and you continue to engage with this person. Maybe you go into some education about neuroscience, or perhaps you might decide that they're just being facetious and you decide to gently disengage. Then we have ventilation. Ventilation is the releasing and the unwinding of these emotions at other times. So for instance, this could just be debriefing with other animal rights activists after an event. We've got ritualization, and this means the generating of the internal emotional energy that keeps the group together and going. So an example of this could be having pep talks after some activism, expression of gratitude towards one another, and sharing of experiences. And then we have microshocking. And this means that when we expose ourselves to transformative events and experiences that build a commitment to the cause. So for instance, this could be attending a vigil to bear witness to pigs being trucked in for slaughter. But it could be even, it could be more lighter things. Like I recall a little while ago, a group of us went to see a film together called The Animal People, which is now on Netflix, by the way. I highly suggest you give it a watch. It's about a group of members of the Animal Liberation Front who go and sabotage the Huntington Life Sciences facility, where they do a lot of animal testing. And I remember walking out of that and talking with a few other people and just how inspiring that was, and how much sort of G'd us up to do some more activism and really, just continue taking it really seriously. And then we've got harnessing feelings of guilt. And this is of not being able to help the infinite number of animals in need. This is especially common in activists who partake in open rescue and who actually physically liberate animals, because they cannot liberate every single animal. Yet the fact that they have to bear witness to them, they looked these animals in the eyes and have had to leave them there, knowing what their fate is, would be absolutely soul crushing. So we need a way to be able to manage these mental challenges. And this is where acceptance and commitment therapy comes in. So as I mentioned, ACT is just a therapeutic modality, and what it's really based on is being able to develop psychological skills to deal with painful thoughts and feelings effectively, in such a way that they have much less impact and influence on us, and that they help to clarify to us what is truly important and meaningful. And this then enhances a drive to action that improves and enriches one's life. So it's really this idea of becoming and increasing our psychological flexibility through becoming a little bit more comfortable with our discomfort, so that we are not so debilitated by it, and that it's not this huge obstruction in the way of us doing what we want to do and being the kind of person that we want to be. So we want to go over the model for ACT, which is the Hexaflex. So the Hexaflex are these 6 processes that we use to access psychological flexibility. We have contact with the present moment. We have acceptance, diffusion, self as context, values, and committed action. So let's start with contact with present moment. Essentially, all this means is mindfulness. Mindfulness means to be psychologically present in the here and now, consciously connecting and engaging with whatever is currently happening. Because much of our mental energy is very much based on the past. We are constantly ruminating, we're constantly rehashing old memories. And likewise, especially if we're depressed or anxious, a lot of that mental energy is based in the future. So it's the worrying, it's the catastrophizing, it's the going through all the potential hypotheticals that you could possibly think of. And we get really stuck in that. And so it leaves very little time and space to really focus on the here and now. And what is even life, if not for the here and now? So we want to be able to develop this flexible attention by moving our attention around to different aspects of our current experience. So these could be internal, like our thoughts, our feelings, our physical sensations, but also our external experiences. So these are things that we pick up through our senses. So what we can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. So before we continue, I want to take a little bit of time to explain exactly why mindfulness is so challenging. Our brains are not really wired for contact with the present moment due to our ancestry in the evolution of anxiety. So if we were to cast our minds back to, let's say, like 100,000 years ago, so this is caveman period of time, this is when our ancestors were living in much more open environments, open to a lot more threat, literally living in caves, and also living in much smaller communities. It was actually really helpful for these people to have anxiety-prone brains. So let's say there's a saber-toothed tiger approaching on the horizon. It's going to be really helpful to be doing things like ruminating on past events to help predict future outcomes, to be worrying, to be catastrophizing, to be going through all the hypotheticals, to be paranoid, to be constantly surveillancing your environment, because these are all the behaviors that are conducive to then preparing for that incoming threat. So when that saber-toothed tiger is right there in front of you, your brain detects imminent threat and your sympathetic nervous system is activated. And that's all of these physiological changes that happen in our body. This includes things like your adrenaline spiking up, your heart racing, your blood rushing to your extremities, your appetite being suppressed, because this is what facilitates you to either fight this threat off, to run away, escape, get the hell out of there, or sometimes even to freeze, which is sort of almost like a dissociative numbing process. And so it's these people who survived those sorts of threatening situations, life or death situations, who were able to live long enough to procreate, and then so on and so forth, that psychological suffering, that anxiety is now encoded into our DNA. It's why we still exist as a species. So essentially, our brains have evolved to become problem-solving machines. And this has been fantastic because in life-threatening situations, that's what keeps us safe. It's just that in contemporary society, when our lives aren't actually threatened, a lot of this disposition to avoid leads to paralyzing avoidance behaviors. Things like withdrawal, procrastination, distraction, things of that nature, because we prefer our comfort zone. We don't like to feel discomfort, distress, pain. And the reason for this is, we call this in psychology the motivational triad, which is what this diagram represents. And the motivational triad is to avoid pain, to seek pleasure, and to conserve energy. So this also actually applies in social situations, as we are wired to be constantly assessing how we fit into our tribe. Because remember, we are animals ourselves and we are a social animal. So if we are, in ancestrally speaking, if we are for whatever reason excluded from our tribe, we likely won't be able to fend for ourselves and survive. We need that in-group congruence to facilitate our sense of safety and security. And it's why even now, the slightest hint of rejection can send many of us spiraling. And it's why, especially in the early days of advocating for the rights of animals and being a vegan, can feel so daunting. We are actively threatening our social bonds and risking isolation. Being a vegan and being an animal rights activist requires us to step back from our instincts and choose behavior that really challenges the status quo. And this is why it's so difficult to remain mindful. Again, our brains are wired to be very past and future oriented, to be constantly assessing to keep ourselves safe. But in saying that, we do also have this skill innately. Like if you were to observe a baby or a young child, they are incredibly attuned with their world around them, and they are incredibly present. You know, they're very perceptive, stick their hands into everything, and they're so inquisitive and curious. It's just that as we grow up into adulthood, that skill gets chipped away, unfortunately. So we want to be a little bit more childlike or more in touch with our animality in that way. So getting back to contact with the present moment, how exactly can we be more mindful? Many people associate meditation with mindfulness, and I just want to specify that meditation is just one form of mindfulness. I prefer the idea of a more integrated mindfulness, and that's just the idea of being able to, with intention, perform a task that you would already perform, just in a mindful manner. So, for example, we've got mindful shower, mindful walk, mindful eating, mindful skincare routine, whatever it might be. All this involves really is just savoring the sensual properties of each moment and redirecting your thoughts, because you will constantly have thoughts that flood your mind, constantly redirecting those thoughts back to your senses every time you notice yourself getting hooked. We call it getting hooked in ACT. It's like the idea where you just get really stuck and taken away, like a thought leads to a thought leads to a thought. So we want to unhook ourselves and redirect to our present moment. Something that I find quite handy with the mindful walk, a little tip here, is to choose a pretty obscure color. So something that I might pick is like a mustard yellow or a lavender. And on my little walk or on the commute to work, if I'm on the bus, I'll see where I can spot that color around me. And it helps to keep me really attuned with my surroundings, keeps me quite vigilant to my, my visual sense. And even if I only do that for 5 minutes, that's 5 minutes of mindfulness. It's a 5-minute break from the chaos that goes up in here. So that's one little tip that I would suggest for anyone. If you do that just a couple of times in your week, you've got a mindful practice there. Next on the Hexaflex, we have acceptance. So acceptance is taught as an alternative to experiential avoidance. So as we've just discussed with our caveman brain, we do have that predisposition to avoid discomfort. So acceptance involves the more active and aware embrace of those private events without unnecessary attempts to change their frequency or form, especially when doing so would cause psychological harm. Also want to mention here that acceptance does not mean liking or approval. Acceptance in this context is just accepting a reality, a current reality for what it is. So in an animal rights context, this could be when we feel really distressed about learning more about the violence against animals, we do not attempt to deny this feeling, nor do we suppress it, nor distract from it, nor eradicate it. We accept this private event for what it is, and we make space for this discomfort. So to be able to accept our inner experiences, we need to be able to recognize our emotions. So what I've got here is just a diagram with emotions that I associate with being an animal rights activist, and I've just categorized them as like primary, secondary, tertiary, just for the sake of giving it a bit of structure. There is no such thing as a good or a bad emotion. All emotions should be validated as an authentic internal experience. It is what we choose to do with these emotions that can lie anywhere on the spectrum of constructive to unconstructive. So some of the emotions that really stick out to me being an animal rights activist, probably the anger, feeling very disillusioned, despair, definitely guilt and shame over past transgressions. But there's also some nice ones in there too, like curiosity, you know, wanting to learn more. Courage is definitely one that we have to exhibit when we're an activist. Grateful for having a community. I'm sure there are plenty more that you guys can think of. I want to spend a little bit more time on anger, as this emotion tends to get a bad rap. So what I've got here, this is supposed to be an iceberg, if you couldn't tell. Anger is kind of like a surface level emotion. That's what shows on the outside. There's often so many more emotions that lie beneath, underneath the ice, under the water. And it's really important to be able to recognize and identify these so we can better do something with them. Because when anger just comes out on the surface without checking in with what else could be there, it often shows as having a short temper and a lot of aggression. It doesn't have to be the case. Because yeah, why do you think the angry vegan stereotype exists? Plenty of reasons here. I think the biggest one is that sense of injustice, a sense of betrayal. Like, why have we only learnt these things, you know, at a point in our lives? Why were we not taught this? Why were we lied to? Why were things omitted from us? And I think oppression, not necessarily being oppressed ourselves, but having empathy, as we've discussed, we have a lot of empathy for animals and feeling the oppression that they experience and wanting to fight for their rights. How do we practice acceptance of emotions? This is where acceptance comes in. And this is acknowledging, allowing, and accommodating our emotions or our uncomfortable experiences. So what I have is an exercise, an experiential exercise that I would really like everyone to do, if possible, called the Mindfulness of Physical Sensations. The purpose of this exercise is to be able to notice an uncomfortable emotion that would typically set us off into a spiral or rash, potentially regrettable behaviors, such as being aggressive, lashing out, going into distraction avoidance, procrastinating, withdrawal, things of that nature. So this exercise gives us a pause and gets us to practice acceptance so we can get to the point where we feel a little bit more settled so that we can make more of an informed decision on what to do next. That's not just based on emotional reactivity or based on instant gratification, which again, remember, we do have a predisposition for. So I'm going to spend the next, it takes about 6 minutes to go through this exercise, and please follow along if you feel comfortable doing so. So to get yourself started, find yourself in a comfortable but alert position. Gently close your eyes, or if you prefer, you can fix your gaze on a spot on the floor or somewhere in front of you. Begin by tuning your breath, noticing each in-breath and each out-breath. There's no need to change your breathing in any way. Just allow it to happen naturally. Now, I want you to bring to mind an emotion you tend to struggle against. It could be anger, fear, sadness, or anything else. Spend some time deliberately bringing to mind a situation that triggers this emotion. Try to picture the situation in detail, really getting in touch with the thoughts that are connected with this emotion. You've probably noticed that when you feel a certain emotion, a whole bunch of thoughts are triggered. For example, when you feel sad, you have thoughts about the sadness, what it is that's making you feel sad, how you feel about the sadness, what the sadness means, and so on. What many people are less aware of is how they experience their emotions in their body. The physical sensations that come up when we experience an emotion. Your experience of your emotions in your body is the focus of this exercise. Now, I want you to become aware of the physical sensations connected to the emotion you're focusing on by slowly scanning your body from head to toe. Notice any sensations in your scalp, forehead, face, eye area, nose, cheeks, jaw, neck, throat, shoulders, chest, upper arms, lower arms, hands, stomach, pelvis, thighs, lower legs, ankles, feet, and toes. Just noticing any sensation that you can feel in any part of your body that seem to be associated with this emotion. You might notice a number of different physical sensations that are linked to the emotion. Try to identify the strongest sensation, the one that bothers you the most. For example, you might notice a heaviness in your chest or a lump in your throat. Once you've chosen an area to focus on, I want you to try to hone in on the sensations that you feel in this area without trying to change them in any way. The aim is to simply observe what's going on in this area of your body, to get to know the physical sensations linked to this particular emotion. Become aware of where the sensation starts and where it ends. What's the shape of the sensation? If you had to draw a line around the sensation, what would it look like? Is the sensation on the surface of your body, inside your body, or both? Where is the sensation the strongest, and where is it the weakest? Notice if the sensation is different in the center compared to the edges. Is there movement in the area, or is the sensation still? Does the sensation feel heavy or light? And how would you describe its temperature? If the sensation had a color, what would you imagine it to be? Spend some time to get to know the subtle details of this physical sensation in your body. You might notice that your mind has a lot to say. Whatever we're doing, our minds tend to chatter away in the background, often quite loudly. When you notice your mind commenting, just gently redirect your attention to the physical sensation that you're focusing on. Once again, noticing where the sensation is located, the size and the shape, whether it's light or heavy, moving or still, hot or cold. Noticing if the sensation has changed in any way since you've been observing it, and noticing how the sensation is made up of smaller sensations, really tuning in to the subtleties of the sensation. Now that you have a sense of how the sensation feels in your body, I want you to take a few deep breaths and attempt to let go of struggling with the sensation. As you do this, keep in mind that by letting go of struggling with the sensation, you're by no means saying that you approve of or want or like the sensation. Just trying to let go of battling against the sensation. Breathe into the physical sensation and imagine that as your breath flows in and around the sensation, you're making room for this sensation in your body. Making space for the feeling and the emotion. Loosening up around it. Accepting it for what it is. Allowing it to be there, even though you don't like or want it to be around. Bear in mind that as you work towards letting go of the struggle with the sensation, you'll probably become distracted and start becoming sidetracked with your thoughts, because this is just what our minds tend to do. Whenever you notice this happening, just briefly note what distracted you, then gently redirect your attention back to the sensation, observing it, breathing into it, and making room for it. Remembering you don't have to like the sensation or want it to be there, you just need to try to make room for it. As you move through this exercise, try to notice the difference between how the sensation is and how your mind tells you it is. Your mind often tries to tell you that this feeling is too painful or too uncomfortable or too overwhelming. For the purpose of this exercise, though, we are not interested in what our minds have to say. Our goal is just to focus on the sensation itself without having to judge it as good or bad. For most of us, this can feel really challenging. You might notice yourself fighting away the sensation, pushing it away, or distracting yourself from it. Whenever you notice this happening, try to gently redirect your attention back to the sensation itself. And keep in mind that the idea of this exercise is not to change, decrease, or get rid of the sensation or emotion. If the sensation changes over the course of this exercise, that's okay. And if it doesn't, that's okay too. The aim is to simply let go of struggling with the sensation and to allow the sensation to be exactly as it is, even though we might not approve of it or want it to be there. Now, coming to the end of this exercise, just shift your attention once more back to your breathing, following each in-breath and each out-breath, and expanding your awareness to become mindful of the sounds in the room, the feeling of your body sitting in the chair or in the bed, and in your own time, you can open your eyes. So thank you for anyone who did participate in that. What we tend to realize during this sort of a practice is that our uncomfortable emotion and the related sensations are not actually completely overwhelming. It's often the thoughts and the narratives that we construct around it that exacerbate this discomfort. We usually realize how centralized the feeling actually is, and through this we can disempower it. You can also be more creative with this sort of an exercise, like when that whole section about getting really detailed with the sensation. You know, you sort of create, it's almost like it becomes its own character, its own entity. And therefore it sort of feels like it's separate. This is also a diffusion strategy. But also, does it have googly eyes? Does it have a gender? Can you give it a name? What can help you to recognize this uncomfortable feeling when it starts to creep up so that you can practice acceptance sooner? Because, I mean, ideally, it would be lovely to get to this sort of a point through practice where your anxiety monster creeps in, and you don't like your anxiety monster. He's not that fun to be around, but he doesn't budge until he wants to move on himself. And so you can hang out on the couch and offer him some tea. So consider some situations where you might find it helpful to practice this. Again, instead of allocating separate time to this, maybe this is something that you can practice while you're having your shower. So you sort of double up on practicing an acceptance and a mindfulness exercise without having to spend more time doing it. Next on the Hexaflex, we have diffusion. So diffusing from our thoughts, feelings or sensations, it just means taking a step back from them. It means separating from them and seeing them for what they truly are, which are just manifestations of our mind. It really is like the power that we feel like these thoughts and feelings have, are the power that we give to them by that idea of getting really hooked and stuck in them. So there's a few ways to diffuse from our thoughts. And the reason that we're doing this is so that they don't so much dictate our behaviors, especially the really non-constructive or even, paralyzing toxic behaviors. So I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of techniques. I do have some of these listed on that resource document that Satario will put up at some point later on. So we have visualizing thoughts. So what this really means is, when you get really stuck on a particular thought, maybe it's, let's say for the sake of this presentation, it's, I'm a terrible activist. So what you do here is you imagine that you've just pulled up, this is purely in your mind, you've pulled up a Word document and you've typed up, I'm a terrible activist. And what you do is you just play around with that writing and see if that helps you to diffuse at all, to unhook, to moderate the intensity or the power that thought holds. So imagine that you've just typed it out in normal font, Times New Roman, it's in black, then maybe change the font size, maybe change the colors. How does a dark red make you feel, as opposed to perhaps a light avocado green? Another thing that you can do with visualizing thoughts is you can put that thought into different contexts. So for instance, imagine it on the cover of a children's book, or on the title of a fancy restaurant menu, or as icing on a vegan cake. Does that do anything? Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to just change up the context to the point where, almost with a bit of a humorous angle, that a lot of the meaning becomes diluted. And then you can unhook and then do what's important. And we've got the leaves on the stream. This is more of a traditional mindfulness meditation exercise using the visual anchor of this nature setting where there are leaves floating down the stream, and you just acknowledge your thoughts, and as they come, you pluck your thought out and you imagine placing on a leaf, and then you let it go. Then we have name the story. So this sort of goes into what we were talking about constructing narratives and feeding into them. So name the story is about being able to recognize when your thoughts start going in that sort of a direction and there's a bit of a theme, and you just label that theme. So for instance, it could be like, here's my not good enough story playing out again, or there goes my nobody likes me story. Again, it helps you to notice it for what it is. It's a manifestation of your mind. It plays into these core beliefs that you have. You can unhook and then redirect. Then we have thanking your mind. This one's my personal favorite one. I think it's really easy and it totally plays back into the whole evolution of anxiety in our caveman brain, because our brains are still very primitive. So this is being able to recognize that because our brains have evolved to become problem-solving machines, that's why we do the catastrophizing and the, going through all the hypotheticals. So it's to be able to recognize that's what's happening and just to say to yourself, thanks mind, all good, I've got this. Next on the Hexaflex, we have self as context. This is the part of you that does all the noticing. It's a safe space inside of you where you can make room for difficult thoughts and feelings, and a perspective from which you can take a step back and observe these internal experiences. Because there's part of your mind that automatically does the thoughts, feelings, sensations. That's just so yeah, like I said, it's automatic, it happens. But then there's another part of you that can observe the fact that you're having these thoughts, feelings, sensations. So that's what we're really trying to harness here. And selfless context is already implicit with some of those previous processes that we have already gone through. A helpful metaphor, because this can be a little bit of an abstract concept, a helpful metaphor to use here is to imagine that your life is a stage show, and that all of your thoughts, your feelings, your memories, everything that you can see, hear, smell, taste, and touch is on that stage. So the observing self is the part of you that watches the stage show. So for instance, imagine you're operating the lighting. So you can choose to focus in on one part of that stage show, or you can zoom back and take in the whole show. And we can enhance our acceptance and diffusion through this transcendental sense of self. So it's really this idea that there's more to you than your body and your mind, because as X, let's say X is anxiety, changes all the time, coming and going, the part of you that notices the anxiety is always there. Moving on, we have some more actionable sides of the Hexaflex. So we've got values. So basically what values are, they're your heart's deepest desires for how you want to behave as a human being. They're not necessarily goals, but they're more so how you want to behave on an ongoing basis. So I've listed a few values that I associate with animal rights activists. I think some big ones here is leadership, collaboration, resilience, perseverance, I think is a huge one. Discipline, authenticity, assertiveness. I'm sure you can think of more. It can be really helpful to be able to identify these values, things that are really important to you, as they can help you to navigate through challenging situations. They kind of act as a compass. And they steer us into taking action that creates internal congruence. So it's one thing to claim that these values are important to you, and it's another thing to actually prove it. We need to show this through our behavior. So this is a sentiment that we talk about a lot when we're doing outreach as animal rights activists, and we already exhibit so much of this. The fact that we're vegan and the fact that we're doing animal rights activism means that we're already doing this in large quantities, but it's important to also to be able to recognize where our gaps are. And that's what leads us to committed action. So acceptance, as we've covered, this means being able to drop the struggle, making peace with our emotions, which is obviously far more constructive than fighting against them or trying to distract or suppress them. But we want to go one step further, and we want to be able to use our emotions and our values to be able to do this. So emotions are like messengers. They carry important information that we can often put to good use. We just need to verify whether that's the case. So consider what message your emotion is trying to deliver. Is this emotion trying to tell you that you need to address something? So let's say, for example, if you feel guilty doing the family groceries because you spend money on animal products for them, that's probably telling you that something needs to change. Is there a value that you can connect this emotion with? So for instance, that your guilt is showing you that you are acting in misalignment with your value of justice, which is evidently really important to you if it's creating this level of distress. And what is the emotion telling you to do differently? Perhaps you need to set some boundaries with family and let them know that you no longer will purchase animal products on their behalf because of what that represents. So can you harness this emotion, and can you construct it in, action it in a constructive way? Also keep in mind that the way that you drive your action might depend on what the emotion is. So let's say, for instance, you're experiencing a highly charged emotion like anger. Anger is the sort of emotion that can really have your blood surging, your muscles tensing, your body's wired for action. Can you go and do a workout? Can you attend that vigil tomorrow with that amount of passion that's flowing through your body? If it's an emotion, perhaps like grief, sadness, that has, it's a bit more depressed, is there an action that you can take that can help you to lean into that slowing down? So perhaps a mindfulness practice, or some relaxing self-care. Committed action may require a particular skill set, like I've just got a few listed here, like assertive communication, decision-making, setting boundaries, starting a project, problem solving, allocating self-care time. There's some resources that may be required that you need to have access to based on the skills that you may or may not have. So this is where it'll be important to be able to assess how actionable these things actually are, and if they're not, or you're having a bit of trouble, that this is opportunity to seek support, whether it's through friends and family or perhaps through a professional means like a psychologist. So committed action allows us to behave in ways that align our values with our behavior, to be able to live authentically. This is the embodiment of integrity. When we commit to small actions, we get to feel a sense of accomplishment and pride, and we get to incentivize ourselves to do something that's a little bit more challenging. Committed action does require some goal setting, and there's also more than one way to execute a goal. So that's what I'm going to cover with this next slide. So we have what I call process focus or outcome focus, which are sort of two different forms of being able to commit to a goal. To be outcome focused, which is what we've got here, is the idea of like all eyes are on the prize. The end point holds such significant weight that the journey just becomes a means to an end. This can be beneficial in that it provides us a vision of what we are aiming for. So in this instance, for animal liberation to be achieved, for some people, they have very high hopes and hope that to be achieved within their lifetimes. But these outcome goals are not always realistic or achievable. But that doesn't mean that they're not worth striving towards. So this is where process focus can be more constructive, as it shifts the emphasis onto more of the how, and it provides more space to be able to savor and really appreciate that journey. So the process focus also allows for more harnessing of our values. So for instance, partaking in activism at least once per week and having an outreach conversation where I am able to provide some education and resources to the person. I might even use Kai McBeth's accountability approach. So that's something I could use, and that's something that I have a lot more control over, as opposed to this goal of, I need to make this person vegan after this one conversation. It's a lot of pressure to put on yourself, and you're not going to know what the outcome of that is, even if they say that they're going to go vegan overnight. You don't know that they're not going to have a steak for dinner. So it's basically adjusting your expectations, and being process focused allows you to be a little bit more proud of yourself and to be able to celebrate the progress that you do make and celebrate those small wins. But what if our goals are intimidating and we don't feel capable of committing to them? We have the exposure hierarchy. So this is a tool that we use to combat phobias. There's actually a therapy called exposure therapy. But I think this applies really nicely to any area that involves uncomfortable mental states. Essentially what we do here is we create a ladder of anxiety-inducing tasks and order them according to what we call subjective units of distress, from 0, so this would be my 0, to 100. The goal is to slowly transition from the bottom to the top, gradually building up resilience and competence to tolerate a greater challenge. So if I've had a really full-on week and feeling really sort of stressed out, a little bit worn down, I'm probably not going to feel up to doing a cube where I'm outreaching and, you know, talking to people, having to be really assertive and courageous. But I might still want to do some activism. So maybe I'll instead do some chalking or some stickering. Maybe I'll just sign a petition, even a donation. So I encourage you to create your own exposure hierarchy when it comes to activism to help you to associate specific tasks with your level of distress tolerance. Remember that we're not trying to avoid discomfort here, but we're trying to figure out what your window of tolerance is so that you can still partake and commit to meaningful activity without having to feel paralyzed, and to also not avoid greater challenges when you do have the capacity to do so. So how can we then alleviate the distress that we do experience? That's where self-care comes in. So just to start with, I want to focus on what I call the holy trinity of self-care, which is sleep, nutrition, and exercise. And these are just the most fundamental physical needs that are helpful to have met. And if any of these are compromised, it's very helpful to be able to recalibrate these so that further self-care can be prioritized. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Something I would recommend, I mean, everyone should be doing this, is to be getting blood tests every so often so you can actually check your levels, and, you know, if there's any deficiencies there, that you adjust your plant-based diet accordingly, and supplement if necessary. Maybe even see a vegan nutritionist or a dietitian. That's something that I've done in the past, if that's accessible to you. There's also so many resources online, so that's something that you can follow up with. Self-care has become a little bit of a buzzword these days. All it really refers to are activities and practices that support our physical, emotional, and mental health. The most important thing is that you are able to identify what activities and practices best support you as an individual to achieve that sense of restoration and recuperation. And that it's space that you get to practice self-compassion as well. Because self-care should not only be time that you take off after reaching a certain point of exhaustion, like, you know, after a point of burnout, but it's something that you want to have sprinkled through your week. Because this is what allows for actual sustainable activism. And it allows us to just sustain our busy lives in general. If there is one self-care activity that I could recommend everyone, it would be journaling. Journaling is itself a diffusion technique, and journaling is something that I get all of my clients on from the very first session. You know, it's a diffusion technique because it helps you to externalize some of the chaos that goes up in your mind to something that's outside of yourself. It's unhooking, and also for the self-management and the introspection that comes with it. I highly recommend an app called Dailyo, which I've also listed on that resources document. And this is essentially, it's actually a mood tracking app. And what it does is you rate your average mood of the day from rad, good, meh, bad, and awful. And then the second step is there's a bunch of different icons that represent different activities. These are all the variables that are supposed to have any influence over your mood. These can be customized, and you just check off all of the activities that you did that day. And then the third step is to write a little bit of a note, a bit of a reflection of what happened that day. And it's just a really, really good habit to get into. I highly encourage journaling. Another one that I would encourage is any sort of experience of joy and laughter. With the amount of distress that we've just spoken about that we experience, it's so important to be able to have a bit of a counterbalance of that, to acknowledge that we may experience some guilt for doing that, especially when so much of what happens to the animals, what they are forced to endure, is constantly on our minds. We can experience some guilt for also having a good time and feeling happy and experiencing joy, but to remind yourself that that is also essential. As an activist, you need to experience that for yourself and for the animals so that you can keep doing activism as well. Self-care alone, however, is not really sufficient in optimizing our well-being. As discussed, we are a social species of animal. And that leads us to community care. Community care means serving those around you with the skills and resources that you have, and also knowing that the same people will have your back when you need help. So if you're not already engaged, I encourage you to join any of the above groups that I've listed here, or any others. This is mostly Sydney based. I can't express enough the importance of connecting with other vegans and animal rights activists. This can be an incredibly isolating philosophy and a movement, and it is integral that we connect with like-minded people. And through that, you also expose yourself to the diversity of thinking and being within our community as well. And the purpose of this is not to contain ourselves within an echo chamber. I mean, this is literally impossible if we're engaging with the world around us, hence Vistopia, but also it's so important to be able to feel understood, to be recognised and also appreciated by others who just get it. I also highly encourage visits to animal sanctuaries. The animal rights movement can be incredibly demoralising at times when progress is so slow. So spending face-to-face time with the animals who have actually survived these industries is so grounding and nourishing. It's a stark reminder of why it is that we do what we do. So remember that even if all you do is donate to these sanctuaries, that itself is a form of activism. This is something that I experience all the time, and I'm sure many of you do as well. But a little while ago, I was speaking with some non-vegan colleagues who were casually talking about their favourite meals, you know, the usual cheese-filled, meat-filled dishes, or even doing group supervision with them, and they're all eating pizza. These are situations where my Vistopia really kicks in, and there was one particular situation where it kicked in really hard. And I was feeling really, really anxious with the knowledge and again, the visuals of animal torment entering my mind. I didn't take the opportunity to assert myself in this situation, being cautious of the aforementioned angry vegan stereotype and creating unwanted social tension. But even still later on, that anxiety was still simmering. So I decided to donate some money. There's a sanctuary called Till the Cows Come Home. And just after doing that, almost immediately, so much of that anxiety resolved. And upon reflection, I can see how I have implemented acceptance, diffusion, values, and committed action in that really small instance. So in summary, coming to the end, animal exploitation is constant, pervasive, and horrendous reality which permeates our world and our minds. Being a vegan and an animal rights activist, being an agent of change is bloody challenging. How could it possibly not be? So remember to validate yourself, to practice self-compassion and community care, and to make some wiggle room for the discomfort and to be able to engage in what is truly important to you. And to end on a hopeful note, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
Thank you so much, Ayanthi.
Thank you.
Let me
stop share. There we go.
That's all good. Let me just set this back up. Oh, thank you so much. That was brilliant. So thought-provoking, so powerful. It certainly got me thinking about a lot of things and different strategies to work on for understanding our own mental health. So thank you so much for putting all that time and effort.
No, it was a pleasure. It really was.
Yeah. So we do have a couple of questions that have popped through in the chat. So I'm just going to read them out to you if that's all right.
Yeah.
So the first question is, any insights into why do vegetarians have a higher EQ score than vegans?
Yes. So that that diagram that I included isn't very telling, because even though they had a slightly higher average, it wasn't statistically significant according to that data. So yeah, I remember thinking like, what's up with that? That doesn't make any sense. But yeah, not statistically significant.
Oh, that's completely fair. Okay. Next question we have is, could you elaborate on what it means to make space for distress? So what doing that is practically?
So I'll talk more about what it is to avoid the discomfort, first of all, I suppose, to answer that question. I've sort of mentioned it a little bit, but when we have discomfort, because we don't like discomfort, a lot of us can engage in behaviours that, at least temporarily, and that's the shortcoming of this strategy, is they temporarily alleviate us from that discomfort. So that's things like we distract ourselves, even like, you know, the amount of time we spend on social media, just mindlessly scrolling, procrastinating on things that need to be done, using substances or food, you know, anything that gives us that instant gratification, that pleasure, because it helps us to avoid that discomfort. So what it means to then make space for the discomfort is that you actively, consciously do not engage in those avoidance behaviors. You create time and space to sit with those uncomfortable, distressing thoughts and emotions and physical sensations. So that exercise that we did is an example of sitting with discomfort.
Unmute myself. Thank you. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to pop it in the Q&A chat. We have about 10 minutes left. In the meantime, however, I'm just going to share the Google Drive link in the main chat that Ayanthi mentioned during her presentation. I've just shared it now. Hopefully you can all see it. Ayanthi's put together some incredible resources in there and a really great sheet which goes through some community groups we can join, steps for going to see a psychologist, and lots of really important stuff in there which will be really helpful for everyone, I'm sure, as well as all the PowerPoint slides. So she's got all of that in that link as well. So yeah, hopefully that link works for everyone. Yeah, let us know if you're having any issues with it. Another question has come through in the meantime is, you seem really calm. How far are you on your journey, Ayanthi?
Oh gosh, I think I might come across as calm because that's my natural disposition, it's my personality. But there's a lot of, probably not so much anxiety, but probably a lot of frustration and anger and all of those classic Vistopia symptoms, which is why I find this sort of modality of acceptance and commitment therapy has been really helpful, because I find it really empowering, because there's this understanding that I can redirect that in some way, whether it's through my online activism, just posting stories on Instagram, or keeping consistent with activism through face-to-face groups and vigils. I sort of use that as a fuel. So how far am I in my journey? I don't think there is an end point. I guess that's sort of another conclusion of this talk, is that I don't think there is this magical realm where you just enter into and you're able to still do activism and be perfectly fine and happy, because like we've discussed, distress is inherent to this movement. We need to use that and facilitate action with that distress.
Yeah, great answer. Another question has come through. I got a bit confused when you got to diffusion and the transcendent self. Can you please explain that transcendent self a bit more?
Sure. So this is like the way that this concept, self as context, is talked about in acceptance commitment therapy, is that it's really confusing, and that we should sometimes not even bother to talk about it with clients, again, because it is implicit in some of the other activities. So again, I'm not going to say anything too different to what I already mentioned. It's, again, this idea that there's part of your mind that has thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And this is such an automatic process. Like, you can't necessarily control the thoughts that pop into your minds. Your neural networks are firing in whatever way that they are. You can't prevent that from happening. But there's part of you that can observe the fact that you're having these thoughts, feelings, the sensations. And this is where the diffusion comes in. It's when we it's like we drive a wedge into that process by doing the active noticing. So it's like, I am noticing, I'm feeling the sense of relief after finishing this presentation. I am noticing an emotion of satisfaction and gratification. I am noticing the thought that I like Satara's lip balm or lip color, whatever it is that you might be wearing right now. So yeah, it's again that slight divide between being able to notice and observe manifestations versus just having them. But yeah, it is supposed to be a little bit of an abstract concept. It's taken from a lot of sort of Eastern philosophy, Buddhism. So maybe that could be an avenue to do a bit more reading into if they want.
Awesome, thank you for that. Another question has come through saying, I've always struggled with ACT therapy. Do you believe some people just can't adopt ACT?
I can understand why it can be difficult to adopt, because the premise that acceptance and commitment therapy is built on is we're not trying to avoid things here. We're not trying to just get rid of our discomfort. We're actively trying to make space for it. And that can be really, that can be like another level of distress for a lot of people. This is something that I make really distinct and clear in my first sessions with clients. Like, we're not trying to get rid of our pain and our distress. We're trying to be get a little bit more comfortable with it, make a little bit more space for it so that it isn't this huge obstacle in the way. It's not this huge barrier. So, this is just one type of therapy out of many. So it's not like this is the be all and end all. Even in my own therapy, like, yes, this is what I predominantly use, but I tap into other therapeutic modalities as well. Like, I use a little bit of CBT. I think schema therapy is a really good one because it sort of goes into the perceptions that we have created over time throughout our childhoods and things that we've learned and experienced. So maybe that would be a different avenue for from that person. Schema therapy.
Awesome. So we've only got like a couple of minutes left. We've got quite a few questions, so I might just have to pick through because we don't want to go too over time. One question has come through is, any person had to deal with the anxiety surrounding potentially contributing to the issues? For example, I'm 6 months pregnant and I'm currently feeling quite guilty about bringing another human into this world who will potentially eat meat and not respect animals. Obviously, I'll try my very best to teach empathy and kindness, but I can't control who this person will be. Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I think it's great that this person has already acknowledged that this is one thing that's outside of her control to a point. And that's such an important feature, is to be able to really identify what is within your control and what is outside of your control. And most things are outside of our control. So I suppose, again, in terms of mitigating that anxiety, probably to do what they've probably already thought about doing. It's like, how can they live in alignment with their values to the point that they can, and, instill these ideas and values into their child, but to be able to have a point where they're able to sort of not entirely disconnect, but to be able to let go with that understanding that there is no foolproof way of controlling this child to the point of them being a vegan for the rest of their lives. I mean, ideally that would happen, but this is why kids go through rebellious phases, right? Even if they were raised in, normal, encouraging ways, that's just sort of the nature of being a kid and growing up. It's not really something you can completely control. So they're still able to really harness those values and just be, as much as possible, directing that to values-oriented action, then they're doing the best they can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll try to get in one more question if that's all right with you, Ayanthi.
Mm-hmm.
Might go a little bit over time, but that's okay. So how would you respond to someone who well-meaningly believes or suggests that it's counterproductive to be so emotionally invested, and that for the sake of effective activism, we should be more dispassionate, like a surgeon?
Yeah, well, sort of what is being described there is kind of like a dissociation or a disconnection, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing. I think there's, the reason that people are able to do that is because it serves a purpose. If that's what allows you to do what needs to be done, do what's important, then and you can do that, then I think that's perfectly fine for anyone who wants to. But I don't think that should be the goal. I don't think that we should have to expect ourselves to just become void of emotion to be able to continue activism. Again, like, it's the emotions that fuel our work. And I guess this is where really allocating time and really prioritizing self-care would hopefully help, because I can imagine that if that's not being catered to, then a lot more frustration and anger would be pent up, and maybe it would come across as being overly emotional during actual activism. So I would say, make more time for self-care.
Awesome. Okay, I lied. There's a good question that's come through, and I would like to
Yeah, no worries. All good.
if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Someone has mentioned, can you describe journaling? Is it simply writing any thoughts slash feelings that come to mind, or is it more targeted? I think that'll be the last question for this evening, guys.
Okay. So this is why I really recommend the Dailyo app. Let me just pull it up on my phone so you know what it looks like. If you can see, I think this is a really good way to do journaling because it's already got a structure. So it's like the mood rating, then you tap the activities, and then you can write something. So you can make it targeted, can make it more general, depends on what you want out of it. I think to start with, just making it general is perfectly fine. Something that I do encourage certain clients who might be really self-deprecating, maybe who would be suffering from depression and disillusionment, would be to include a gratitude practice in there. If there are people who have really low self-esteem and where that becomes a presenting issue that we're targeting in therapy, I would recommend that they include what I was proud of myself for today into that practice as well. So yeah, it kind of depends on what you want out of it. Keeping it general is fine to begin with.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ayanthi. I just wanted to say a quick shout out to the fact that this webinar was open to like anyone. So I know a lot of people who joined tonight may not be a part of Young AJP, but if you have any young siblings or family or friends who would like to be involved in the political end of advocacy and join a lot of our exclusive events and opportunities that we have when you become a Young AJP member, then we'll definitely invite you guys to hop onto the AJP website and to become a Young AJP member. So I think that's all we have time for tonight. So thanks so much again, Ayanthi, for all your efforts in putting together that amazing presentation, and everyone for taking time out of your day to join us tonight. So I think that'll be it. I'll leave you guys to it and have a nice night, everyone.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
See ya.